Marcus Reynolds stood before the court, his chains rattling softly as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The silence in courtroom 4B grew heavy as everyone waited for him to speak. His public defender, David Martinez, watched nervously, hoping his client would stick to the prepared statement they had practiced. "Your Honor," Reynolds began, his voice surprisingly soft. "I've been thinking about what to say." He paused, swallowing hard. The muscle in his jaw twitched, and suddenly his demeanor changed completely. His eyes darkened, and his voice rose sharply. "You know what? Forget this whole act." Martinez quickly stood up, placing a hand on Reynolds' arm. "Marcus, remember what we discussed." Reynolds violently shrugged off his lawyer's touch. "Get your hands off me," he shouted, causing several people in the gallery to gasp. The security officers immediately stepped forward, but Reynolds was already in full explosion mode. 15 years? He screamed, spittle flying from his mouth as he glared at Assistant District Attorney Palmer. "You want to give me 15 years? For taking a few $100s?" His handcuffed hands slammed down on the defense table, making everyone jump. Judge Chen's finger hovered over the panic button beneath her bench, but she remained outwardly calm. "Mr. Reynolds, I must warn you." "Warn me?" Reynolds laughed, but it was a harsh, bitter sound that echoed off the courtroom walls. "Let me warn you something, Judge." He took a step forward, causing Officers Sullivan and Rodriguez to immediately move closer. "You think these walls can hold me forever? You think 15 years is going to keep me locked up for good?" The court reporter's fingers flew across her stenograph, capturing every word of Reynolds' outburst. Maria Gutierrez, the Herald reporter, scribbled frantically in her notepad, knowing this was no ordinary sentencing hearing anymore. "When I get out," Reynolds continued, his voice dropping to a menacing growl, "I'm gonna find you, Judge Chen. I'm gonna make you pay. I'll show you what real justice looks like." His eyes were wild now, filled with a rage that seemed to have been building for years. Officer Sullivan grabbed Reynolds' arm, but Reynolds wasn't finished. "You sit up there in your fancy robe, playing God with people's lives. You don't know nothing about my life, about what I've been through." The gallery erupted in chaos. Several spectators rushed for the exit, while the law students sat frozen in their seats, wide-eyed at the unfolding drama. Judge Chen remained seated, her expression unchanged, though her heart raced beneath her judicial robe. "Get him under control," Palmer demanded as Reynolds continued to struggle against the officers. Officer Rodriguez pulled out her taser, holding it ready. "Sir, stand down immediately." Reynolds wasn't listening anymore. He tried to lunge forward despite his restraints, knocking over the defense table with a crash that echoed through the courtroom. Papers scattered across the floor as Martinez scrambled backward, his briefcase spilling open. "I'll find you," Reynolds shouted at Judge Chen, even as the officers wrestled him to the ground. "When I get out, you better watch your back. You hear me? Your fancy security won't save you then." The judge's clerk had already pressed the panic button, and additional security officers burst through the courtroom doors. They quickly surrounded Reynolds, who continued to thrash and shout threats even as they secured him. Through it all, Judge Chen sat perfectly still, her hands folded on the bench before her. She watched as Reynolds was forcibly restrained, his threats still echoing off the walls. The other people in the courtroom expected her to immediately hold him in contempt, to add years to his sentence for his outburst. Instead, she did something that surprised everyone. She picked up her gavel and struck it once, the sharp crack cutting through the chaos. "This court will take a 30-minute recess," she announced, her voice steady and clear. "Officers, please secure the defendant in the holding cell. Mr. Martinez, Ms. Palmer, please approach the bench before we break." As Reynolds was dragged from the courtroom, still shouting threats, Judge Chen gathered her papers with deliberate calm, but behind her composed exterior, her mind was already working, processing what she had just witnessed. There was something in Reynolds' outburst, beyond the threats and rage, that had caught her attention. Something in his words about not knowing his life, about what he'd been through. As the courtroom slowly emptied, she knew the decision she would make next would either prove to be the biggest mistake of her career or the most important moment of truth in her time on the bench. During the 30-minute recess, Judge Chen sat in her chambers, surrounded by the familiar comfort of law books and the gentle hum of her desk fan. She had removed her black robe, now hanging it carefully on the wooden coat stand in the corner. On her desk lay Marcus Reynolds' complete file, not just his criminal record, but his entire life history. Her clerk, Jenny Thompson, knocked softly before entering with a cup of chamomile tea. "Are you sure you don't want me to call for extra security, Judge?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. Those threats seemed pretty serious. Judge Chen shook her head, her reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose as she flipped through the yellowed pages of old social service reports. "Thank you, Jenny. That won't be necessary." She paused at a particular document, her finger tracing along the lines of text. The file told a story that few had bothered to read completely. Born to a drug-addicted mother who died when he was 6, father unknown. Bounced between 7 different foster homes before age 12. Diagnosed with PTSD and depression at 13, but never received consistent treatment. First arrest at 14 for stealing food from a convenience store. In the holding cell, Reynolds sat with his head in his hands, the adrenaline from his outburst long gone, replaced by a hollow feeling in his stomach. Officer Sullivan stood guard outside, occasionally glancing in at the now quiet prisoner. Meanwhile, Assistant DA Palmer paced the hallway outside the judge's chambers, frustrated and angry. "This is ridiculous," she muttered to David Martinez, who sat on a nearby bench reviewing his notes. He threatened a judge in open court. "We should be filing additional charges, not taking a recess." Martinez looked up from his papers. "Maybe Judge Chen sees something we don't," he replied quietly. "She's never been one to make hasty decisions." Back in her chambers, Judge Chen had reached the most recent psychological evaluation of Reynolds, conducted just after his arrest for the armed robbery. The psychiatrist's notes painted a picture of a man trapped in a cycle of trauma and violence, never having received the help he needed to break free. She thought about the moment in court when Reynolds had snapped. His words echoed in her mind. "You don't know nothing about my life, about what I've been through." But now she did know, or at least she understood better than she had before. At exactly 30 minutes, Judge Chen stood up, straightened her robe, and walked back into courtroom 4B. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The gallery had thinned considerably, though Maria Gutierrez remained, pen poised over her notepad. "Bring in the defendant," Judge Chen ordered, her voice firm and clear. Reynolds was led back in, this time with additional restraints. His earlier fury had subsided, replaced by a look of resigned defeat. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, avoiding everyone's gaze. "Mr. Reynolds," Judge Chen began, causing him to finally look up. "Before we proceed, I want to acknowledge something." She paused, making sure she had his full attention. "You are right." A murmur of surprise rippled through the courtroom. Palmer's head snapped up in shock, while Martinez leaned forward, intrigued. "I didn't know about your life or what you've been through," Judge Chen continued. "But I do now. I've spent this recess reading your complete file, not just your criminal record, but your whole story." Reynolds' expression changed slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "I read about your mother, about the foster homes, about the diagnosis you received at 13, but never got proper treatment for. I read about your first arrest for stealing food." Judge Chen's voice remained steady, but carried a note of compassion that filled the courtroom. "Your Honor," Palmer interjected, standing up. "While the defendant's background is tragic, it doesn't excuse." "I'm not excusing anything, Miss Palmer," Judge Chen cut her off firmly. "I'm understanding it. There's a difference." She turned back to Reynolds. "Mr. Reynolds, the threats you made against me earlier were serious, and they will have consequences. However, before we address those, I want you to understand something else." She paused, making sure her next words would have their full impact. "The system failed you, Mr. Reynolds. Multiple times, in multiple ways. That doesn't justify your actions, but it does help explain them. And now, I have a choice to make, one that will affect both our lives in ways you might not expect." The courtroom held its breath, waiting to hear what this unconventional judge would do next. Judge Chen leaned forward in her chair, her hands clasped together on the bench. The entire courtroom remained silent, waiting for her next words. Marcus Reynolds stood still, his earlier aggression replaced by a look of uncertain curiosity. "Mr. Reynolds," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom, "I've been a judge for 10 years. In that time, I've sentenced hundreds of people. But today, I'm going to do something different." Assistant DA Palmer shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clearly anticipating something unprecedented. David Martinez, Reynolds' public defender, sat up straighter, his expression hopeful but cautious. The standard sentence for your crimes, considering your prior record in today's outburst, would be 15 to 20 years, Judge Chen continued. However, I see something in your file that concerns me deeply. You've been in and out of the system since you were 14, but not once, not a single time, has anyone actually addressed the root causes of your behavior. Reynolds swallowed hard, his handcuffs clicking softly as he shifted his weight. For the first time since his outburst, he looked directly at the judge, really seeing her. Your psychiatric evaluations all tell the same story. PTSD, depression, untreated trauma from childhood. You've been prescribed medications at various times but never received consistent treatment. You've been offered occasional counseling sessions but never long-term therapy. In short, Mr. Reynolds, the system has been content to simply warehouse you without actually trying to help you heal. Officer Sullivan, still standing close to Reynolds, noticed something change in the defendant's posture. The usual defensive tension began to fade, replaced by something that looked almost like attention. So here's what I'm proposing, Judge Chen said, picking up a document from her bench. 12 years instead of 15, but with conditions that I will personally oversee. She held up her hand as Palmer started to object. Ms. Palmer, you'll have your chance to speak, but right now, I'm addressing Mr. Reynolds. She turned back to the defendant. These conditions are non-negotiable, Mr. Reynolds. First, you will participate in intensive psychiatric treatment. Not just occasional sessions, but a comprehensive program designed specifically for trauma survivors. Second, you will complete your GED and take college courses. Yes, I said college courses. I've reviewed your academic records from before you dropped out. You had the intelligence. You just never had the chance. Reynolds' eyes widened slightly. Nobody had mentioned college to him before, not in any of his previous encounters with the justice system. Third, Judge Chen continued, you will participate in a mentor program with former inmates who have successfully rehabilitated themselves. And fourth, you will undergo anger management training and conflict resolution therapy. She paused, letting her words sink in. The courtroom remained absolutely silent. Even Maria Gutierrez had stopped writing, her pen hovering above her notepad as she listened intently. Now, about those threats you made earlier, Judge Chen's voice took on a firmer tone. They will add 6 months to your sentence, served consecutively. Not because I feel personally threatened, but because we must maintain order in this courtroom. However, those 6 months will also include additional counseling sessions focused specifically on anger management. Reynolds stood there, processing her words. The judge could see the confusion in his eyes, the struggle to understand why she wasn't simply throwing the book at him. Your Honor, Palmer finally spoke up, rising from her seat. While I appreciate your creative approach, the state must object. Mr. Reynolds has shown himself to be violent and unrepentant. The people of Florida deserve a justice system that actually attempts to rehabilitate offenders, not just punish them, Judge Chen interrupted firmly. Ms. Palmer, how many times has Mr. Reynolds been through our system? How many times have we simply locked him away, only to see him return? Einstein defined insanity as doing the same thing repeatedly and expecting different results. Perhaps it's time we tried something new. She turned back to Reynolds. Mr. Reynolds, I'm offering you something here that you've never had before, a real chance. Not just at freedom, but at healing, at learning, at becoming the person you could have been if life had dealt you a better hand. The question is, are you willing to take that chance? The silence that followed was heavy with possibility. Reynolds stood at a crossroads, facing a choice he never expected to have. And Judge Chen waited, knowing that what happened next would either validate her unconventional decision or prove her critics right. The next few moments would change both their lives forever. Marcus Reynolds stood frozen in place, the judge's words echoing in his mind. The courtroom waited in tense silence for his response. His hands, still in cuffs, trembled slightly as he struggled to find his voice. He started, then stopped. For the first time in his adult life, someone was offering him more than just punishment. Someone was seeing him as more than just his crimes. Nobody's ever. His voice cracked, and he had to take a deep breath to steady himself. David Martinez, his public defender, watched his client with growing amazement. In all the years he worked in the public defender's office, he'd never seen a hardened defendant break down like this. "Take your time, Mr. Reynolds," Judge Chen said softly, her voice carrying a gentle patience that surprised even her regular courtroom staff. Reynolds squared his shoulders, trying to maintain his composure. "All my life," he began again, his voice rough with emotion, "people just saw what I did wrong. Nobody ever asked why. Nobody ever." He paused, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. "Nobody ever cared enough to try and fix what was broken." The gallery sat in stunned silence. Even Assistant D.A. Palmer's stern expression had softened slightly. Maria Gutierrez's pen moved rapidly across her notepad, capturing every word of this extraordinary moment. "When I was a kid," Reynolds continued, the words now flowing more freely, "after my mama died, I got pushed around from home to home. Some were okay, some were." He shook his head, leaving the darker memories unspoken. "But nobody ever stayed. Nobody ever stuck around long enough to help." Judge Chen nodded encouragingly, her eyes never leaving his face. "And how did that make you feel, Mr. Reynolds?" "Angry," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "So angry I couldn't think straight sometimes. Like there was this fire inside me that wouldn't go out." He looked down at his hands, at the tattoos that marked his years behind bars. "I started stealing 'cause I was hungry. Then I kept stealing 'cause it felt like the only thing I could control. Then I got older, and the anger got bigger, and," he gestured helplessly at himself, at what he'd become. Officer Sullivan, who had witnessed countless courtroom scenes over his career, found himself moved by Reynolds' raw honesty. He shifted his weight, maintaining his professional stance while feeling the emotional weight of the moment. "Your Honor," Reynolds said, looking directly at Judge Chen, "I know I messed up. I know I scared people in that store. I know I scared you today with what I said." He swallowed hard. I never had nobody offer to help me before. Not really help, you know." Judge Chen leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Reynolds, I want to be very clear about something. This program I'm offering isn't easy. It will require more of you than any sentence you've served before. You'll have to confront your trauma, face your demons, and work harder than you've ever worked in your life. Are you prepared for that?" The courtroom held its breath, waiting for his answer. Reynolds stood straighter, and for the first time, a flicker of something that looked like hope crossed his face. "Yes, Your Honor," he said firmly. "I want to try. Really try this time." Palmer stood up, her expression conflicted. "Your Honor, while the defendant's sincerity is moving, the state must still consider the victims of his crime. Mr. Kim, the store owner, is still traumatized by the robbery." Judge Chen nodded. "Yes, Ms. Palmer, and that's why the next part of Mr. Reynolds' program will include restorative justice sessions. Mr. Reynolds, are you willing to face the people you've harmed? To hear their stories and work to make amends?" Reynolds paled slightly but nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I need to face what I did. All of it." "Very well," Judge Chen said, picking up her gavel. "Then I am prepared to deliver my final sentence." She paused, looking around the courtroom. "But before I do, I want everyone here to understand something. Today, we're not just passing sentence on Mr. Reynolds. We're also acknowledging our own responsibility as a society, as a system, to do better. To be better." The weight of her words settled over the courtroom like a heavy blanket. What happened next would either mark the beginning of a remarkable transformation or prove that some cycles simply couldn't be broken. Judge Chen lifted her gavel, the courtroom completely silent as she prepared to deliver the final sentence. Marcus Reynolds stood with his shoulders straight, though his hands still trembled slightly at his sides. "Marcus Reynolds," she began formally, "this court sentences you to 12 years in the Florida State Correctional System, with an additional 6 months for contempt of court." She paused, looking directly at him. "However, as discussed, this sentence comes with specific conditions that will be strictly monitored by this court." She picked up a document and began reading. "First, you will be transferred to the Riverside Correctional Facility, which has one of the state's most comprehensive mental health programs. There, you will receive weekly trauma-focused therapy sessions and participate in group counseling." Reynolds nodded, his expression serious and attentive. Gone was the angry man who had threatened her life just hours ago. Second, you will enroll in the prison's education program within your first month of arrival. Your first goal will be completing your GED. Once achieved, you will begin college-level courses through our partnership with Miami State University's distance learning program. Assistant DA Palmer watched with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. She'd never seen Judge Chen craft such a detailed rehabilitation plan for any defendant before. Third, Judge Chen continued, you will participate in the Victims Impact Program. This includes meeting with Mr. Kim, the store owner, in a controlled environment with trained mediators present. You will listen to how your actions affected him and his family and work toward making meaningful amends. Reynolds swallowed hard but maintained eye contact with the judge. Yes, Your Honor. Fourth, you will attend anger management sessions twice weekly for the first year, then weekly thereafter. You will also participate in conflict resolution workshops and stress management training. Officer Sullivan, still standing guard, noticed how Reynolds seemed to be mentally noting each requirement, his focus unwavering. Fifth, you will be assigned a mentor from our Reformed Offenders Program. This person will have successfully rehabilitated themselves and can guide you through the challenges you'll face. You will meet with them monthly. Judge Chen set down her paper and leaned forward slightly. Mr. Reynolds, I'm also requiring quarterly progress reports sent directly to my chamber. I want to personally monitor your progress and address any issues that arise. David Martinez smiled slightly, realizing that his client was getting an unprecedented opportunity for real rehabilitation. Additionally, the judge continued, if you maintain good behavior and complete all required programs successfully, you may be eligible for supervised work release programs in your 10th year. This could help you develop job skills before your release. She paused, making sure Reynolds understood the significance of everything she was offering. Do you understand all these conditions, Mr. Reynolds? Yes, Your Honor, he replied, his voice stronger now. I understand, and I want to do this. I really do. Very well. Judge Chen looked around the courtroom before continuing. Let the record show that this sentence is designed to address both the punitive and rehabilitative aspects of justice. Mr. Reynolds will serve time for his crimes, but he will also receive the help and support he should have received years ago. She turned to Palmer. Ms. Palmer, the state's concerns about public safety have been noted. However, I believe that true public safety is best served by rehabilitation, not mere punishment. Palmer nodded reluctantly, knowing she had no grounds for appeal given the sentence was within legal guidelines. Mr. Reynolds, Judge Chen said, addressing him one final time, I want you to understand something. This program I've designed for you, it's not just about serving time. It's about healing, learning, and growing. It's about breaking the cycle that's held you captive for so long. Reynolds stood straighter, and for the first time, there were tears in his eyes. Thank you, Your Honor. I won't let you down. Don't think about letting me down or proving me right, she replied gently. Think about proving yourself right. Think about becoming the person you were meant to be before life dealt you such a difficult hand. With that, she raised her gavel. This court is adjourned. Officers, please escort Mr. Reynolds to processing. The gavel fell with a sharp crack that seemed to echo with finality. As Reynolds was led away, Judge Chen noticed something different in his walk, a new purpose in his steps, a glimmer of hope where before there had only been despair. She knew the real work was just beginning, but for the first time in his troubled life, Marcus Reynolds had been given a real chance at change. 3 years passed since that remarkable day in Judge Chen's courtroom. The morning sun streamed through the windows of her chambers as she sat at her desk, reviewing a thick manila envelope marked Quarterly Progress Report. Inmate Reynolds, Marcus. Her clerk, Jenny Thompson, brought in the usual morning tea and paused. Is that another update from Reynolds? She asked, noticing the familiar prison letterhead. Judge Chen nodded, a slight smile playing at her lips as she read. 3 years, she mused, and he hasn't missed sending a single report. She flipped through the pages, each one documenting another step in Reynolds' transformation. The report from Dr. Sarah Williams, the prison's lead psychiatrist, was particularly encouraging. Mr. Reynolds continues to make exceptional progress in his therapy sessions. His understanding of his trauma responses has deepened significantly, and he's developed healthy coping mechanisms for managing his anger. Next came the education report. Reynolds had not only completed his GED in his first year, but had maintained a 3.8 GPA in his college courses. His current professor had written, Marcus shows remarkable insight in his criminal justice essays, often drawing from personal experience to analyze systemic issues in our correctional system. Officer Mike Rodriguez, who had transferred to Riverside Correctional Facility the same year as Reynolds, had included his own observations. Inmate Reynolds has become a positive influence on other prisoners. He leads study groups, mentors new inmates, and has prevented several potential violent incidents through peer mediation. But what caught Judge Chen's attention most was the letter from Mr. Kim, the convenience store owner Reynolds had robbed. After the restorative justice sessions, Mr. Kim had written, I came to these meetings full of anger and fear. I left with understanding and, surprisingly, hope. Mr. Reynolds' remorse is genuine, and his efforts to change are inspiring. As she read through the reports, Judge Chen remembered the angry, desperate man who had stood in her courtroom 3 years ago, threatening her life. The contrast between that person and the one described in these reports was striking. The phone on her desk buzzed. Judge Chen, her secretary's voice came through. The video conference with Riverside Correctional is ready. She straightened her robe and moved to her computer screen. When the video connected, she saw Marcus Reynolds sitting in the prison's conference room, wearing a clean blue prison uniform. His face had softened over the years, the permanent scowl replaced by calm determination. Good morning, Mr. Reynolds, she greeted him. Good morning, Your Honor, he replied, his voice steady and clear. Thank you for taking the time to meet with me. I've been reading your latest progress reports, she said, holding up the manila envelope. Your teachers, therapists, and officers all speak very highly of your progress. Reynolds nodded, a hint of pride crossing his face. It hasn't been easy, he admitted. Some days are harder than others. But having a purpose, having people believe in me, it makes a difference. Tell me about your mentor program, Judge Chen prompted. Reynolds' face lit up. We've got 15 guys now in our study group. We help them prepare for their GED, teach them meditation techniques, show them there's another way. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I keep thinking about what you said that day in court about breaking cycles. That's what we're trying to do. Judge Chen noticed the books stacked neatly on the table beside him, college textbooks on psychology and criminal justice. And your studies? She asked. I'm maintaining my GPA, he said. The professors say I might be able to work in rehabilitation counseling after I'm released. Maybe help others who've been where I've been. The judge felt a warmth of satisfaction spread through her chest. This was why she had become a judge, not just to punish, but to help create positive change when possible. Mr. Reynolds, she said softly, do you remember what you said to me 3 years ago? He looked down, shame crossing his face. Yes, Your Honor. I threatened you. I was so angry then, so lost. That's not what I meant, she interrupted gently. I meant when you said nobody had ever cared enough to try and fix what was broken. I want you to know something. You're doing that work yourself now. You're fixing what was broken, piece by piece. Reynolds looked up, his eyes glistening. Thank you, Your Honor, for seeing something in me that I couldn't see in myself back then. As the video call ended, Judge Chen sat back in her chair, thinking about how sometimes justice wore different faces. Sometimes it came with handcuffs and prison bars, but sometimes it came with second chances and transformation. 10 years had passed since Marcus Reynolds first stood in Judge Chen's courtroom. On a bright Miami morning, the judge sat in her chambers, holding a letter that had arrived that morning. It wasn't from the prison this time. Reynolds had been released 2 months ago, after serving his full sentence with exemplary behavior. The letter was written on the letterhead of New Beginnings Rehabilitation Center, where Reynolds now worked as a counselor for troubled youth. His neat handwriting filled 2 pages. Dear Judge Chen, I'm writing to share something important with you. Yesterday, I met a 16-year-old boy named Tyler in our center. He reminded me so much of myself at that age, angry, scared, feeling like the whole world was against him. As I sat across from him, I remembered standing in your courtroom a decade ago, making threats and feeling just as lost. But this time, I was sitting in a different chair. I was the one who could offer help, understanding, and hope. I told Tyler my story, our story, about how one person's belief in change can transform a life. I'm proud to tell you that I've been clean and sober for 10 years now. My degree in criminal justice hangs on my office wall, right next to my counseling certification. Every day, I work with young people who are standing at the same crossroads where I once stood. Mr. Kim's convenience store? I stop by there every week now. Not to shop, though I do that too, but to talk with him. He's become a mentor to other store owners in the neighborhood, sharing our story of restorative justice. Sometimes he even refers troubled kids to our center. Remember Officer Sullivan from your courtroom? He retired last year, but before he did, he came to speak at one of our youth programs. He told them about watching my transformation and how it changed his view of rehabilitation. The anger management techniques I learned in prison, I teach them now. The therapy sessions that helped me understand my trauma, I use that knowledge to help others face their own demons. The education you insisted I get, it opened doors I never knew existed. But most importantly, Judge Chen, I want you to know that your decision that day didn't just save my life. It's helping save others now. Every time I share my story with a troubled teen or a frustrated parent, I'm passing on the chance you gave me. Last week, I was invited to speak at the State Judicial Conference about rehabilitation programs in the criminal justice system. As I stood at the podium, looking out at all those judges, I thought about that day in your courtroom. I thought about how different my life, and the lives of countless others, might have been if you had simply thrown the book at me like everyone expected. I keep a framed copy of my sentencing document in my office. Kids sometimes ask me about it, and I tell them it's my second chance paper. It reminds me every day that change is possible, that redemption is real, and that sometimes the people who believe in us when we don't believe in ourselves are the ones who help us find our way. Thank you, Judge Chen, not just for the sentence you gave me, but for seeing the person I could become when all I could show you was the person I was. With eternal gratitude, Marcus Reynolds, Lead Counselor, New Beginnings Rehabilitation Center. Judge Chen wiped a tear from her eye as she finished reading. She opened her desk drawer and pulled out an old newspaper clipping from the Miami Herald, dated 10 years ago. The headline read, "Judge's controversial sentence raises eyebrows." She smiled, remembering the criticism she had faced for her decision. She picked up her phone and dialed her clerk. "Jenny, please clear my schedule for next Thursday afternoon. I'd like to visit New Beginnings Rehabilitation Center." As she put down the phone, she noticed a new email from the State Judicial Committee. They were requesting her input on reforming sentencing guidelines to include more rehabilitation-focused options. She opened a new document and began typing, drawing from 10 years of evidence that justice and mercy could work hand in hand. On her wall hung a simple frame containing the words that had guided her career. "Justice without compassion is not justice at all." Below it now sat a new edition, a photograph from Reynolds' college graduation ceremony in prison, his smile bright with hope and possibility. The morning sun streamed through her window, casting long shadows across her desk, reminding her that even in the darkest moments, light could find its way through, if someone was willing to open the blinds.